Okay, so we've just gotten in all of the new M1 Pro MacBooks to the studio, and in this video, we're going to be comparing the 14-inch base model M1 Pro MacBook against the previous generation 2020 M1 MacBook Pro. All right, so first things first, let's get into some size, weight, and dimension differences. So what I'll do is I'll actually put up a list of the different dimensions and differences on the screen, but just right off the bat, in terms of footprint, you can see they are essentially almost exactly the same size. We've got maybe half a centimeter on the front here, and then on the sides, they're almost exactly the same. And you can see there, the physical thickness, they are very, very similar. You can see that the M1 Pro MacBook is just a slight bit thicker. And in terms of weight, although there is a slight difference, you really can't tell that much. Now, moving on to ports, on the left-hand side, you can see the differences here. So obviously on the M1 Pro MacBook, you have the MagSafe charger, you have two Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports, you also have the headphone jack, versus the previous gen Mac, you just have the two Thunderbolt ports. Moving over to the right side, you can see again some massive differences. We have a HDMI port, another Thunderbolt 4 port, and an SD card port versus just a headphone jack on the previous generation M1 MacBook. Now, moving on to the keyboard and trackpad, very minimal differences here, at least in terms of how far the keys to press and just overall typing experience. They're both almost the exact same. I will actually give a slight edge to the new M1 Pro MacBook. It feels a little bit more tight and nicer to use. That might also be this keyboard has been used for a year, so it's a little bit squishy. In terms of the trackpad, exact same, there's no differences there at all. Now, if you guys are interested, this is how far the hinge goes back on both devices. As you can see, again, both almost exactly the same, almost no differences at all. And moving on to webcam and microphone quality, on the old generation M1 MacBook, we have the typical 720p webcam. We've also got the standard microphone. And moving over to the M1 Pro webcam, we have an upgraded 1080p resolution, and we also have a studio quality mic array. One thing to mention as well, the previous generation M1 MacBook only has support for one external monitor, whereas the new M1 Pro, you can connect up to two Pro Display XDRs. Moving on to chargers, they are both very similar. They both output about the same wattage. On the previous generation M1 MacBook charger, it is obviously just USB-C, and you can obviously detach everything as usual. And for the new charger for the M1 Pro, you can see we have some slight differences, although it is still very similar. First of all, we have MagSafe as the connection mechanism. You can still detach this cable, and the head, it's the exact same as the previous generation, although with the cable, it is braided, so you get a much higher quality, which means it has a reduced chance of ripping or tearing or breaking due to bending. Now for this next part, I'm gonna switch off the neon light so you can see the screen a little bit easier. Now for a quick speaker test. Now this has the 6-speaker high fidelity sound system, and this is obviously just the stock standard MacBook with relatively okay speakers. So let's play this first. And now the 14-inch MacBook. So I'm not sure if you can hear that through the microphone, you probably can't, but this is hands down a lot better quality. This is almost tinny sounding compared to this, and these speakers will also get a lot louder than what these can do. So in terms of screen size, there are some similarities and some major differences. The first being obviously the physical dimensions of the screen. 13.3 inches on the previous generation MacBook Pro versus 14 inches on the new 14-inch model. We have a 2560 by 1600 resolution on the previous gen and a 3024 by 1964 resolution on the 14-inch M1 Pro. Now, taking a look at the quality and colors of the panels of these MacBooks, I'm playing the Sony colors test in 4K, and you can see here there's not really a massive difference between the two at first glance, but in person you can certainly see a slight increase in contrast and quality and overall brightness on the M1 Pro screen. That is, of course, because this is a simple Retina screen versus a liquid Retina XDR. Now, both of these displays have P3 wide color gamut, so they're gonna be great for editing. But one thing you should know is the MacBook Pro brightness only goes up to 500 nits versus the M1 Pro 14-inch at 1000 nits. Now, getting back to the different types of screens, this has a massive pro over this because you can actually use this for full-on professional video and photo editing. And I think for a lot of people, this is going to be a great monitor / laptop to have off the side, hooked up to your main monitor. And this can maybe act as a cheaper XDR display off to the side instead of having to go off and buy your own separate expensive XDR display. Also, to mention the refresh rate of both of these panels, this is a simple 60 Hz refresh rate, and on the new 14-inch M1 Pro, we have the 120 Hz ProMotion display, which intelligently scales up and down depending on what you're doing. If you want to check out some 120 Hz gaming on this machine, I will link that video in the top right-hand corner. Now, a quick Blackmagic disk speed test. As you guys can see here very, very clearly, you're getting almost double the speeds on the 14-inch MacBook Pro SSD. Now, this can do up to, I think, 7.6 gigabytes per second read and write speed, but you do have to spend extra and get the larger SSDs. For the smaller 512 and 1 terabyte, these are the sorts of speeds you'll be getting, which isn't too shabby at all. Moving on to the Geekbench CPU benchmarks, you can see we have just started the test. There should be a fairly significant difference here because the previous gen has an 8-core CPU with 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores versus 6 high-performance cores and just 2 efficiency cores on the new M1 Pro. Looking at the scores here, we have 7,730 for the multi-core score on the previous gen MacBook Pro. We're not really interested in the single core scores versus 9,957 on the 14-inch M1 Pro. So there's a difference of about 25%, which makes sense. This has an additional 2 performance cores. And also guys, as you will see in the testing in this video, this is going to benefit quite a lot from the increased bandwidth of 200 gigabytes per second. So moving on from the Geekbench results here, let's try a quick compute test, and we're going to set both of these to metal. Now, here is where we start seeing some significant differences between the two in terms of the GPU, and I will be referring back to this throughout the video, so stay tuned. We can see the metal score on the previous gen MacBook, 21,839 versus 38,547 on the new generation. And this does make total sense because this has 8 cores and this has 14, but you're seeing almost double the performance out of this machine. Moving on to my favorite CPU benchmarking test, and that is Cinebench. So we're gonna start this, we're gonna leave it for a couple of minutes, and then I'll come back with a FLIR thermals test to test the fan noise and also the temperatures of both of these machines. Now that this has been going for about 10 minutes, let's have a look at the CPU temperatures. Now on the previous gen Mac, you can see that we are looking pretty toasty. So we're sitting at around 90 to 92 degrees Celsius for the performance cores. We only want to look at the performance cores, guys, because the efficiency cores aren't getting slammed, with an overall CPU average temperature of about 85 degrees. So CPU temp for this one is about 90 to 92 degrees. Unfortunately, on the M1 Pro, this same tool doesn't show you the CPU temperatures. I believe it's a limitation with Monterey. By the way, both of these machines are on the latest version of macOS Monterey. Moving on to actual physical temperatures of the chassis, we can get a good bird's eye view here of how the thermal signature differs between the two. So on the previous gen MacBook, we have most of the heat sort of towards the middle left here, and at its peak, we're sitting at around 38 to 39 degrees Celsius. And you can see at the exhaust up here at about 40 degrees Celsius. And then if we contrast this with the cooler parts, you can see the touchpad about 30 degrees, and then the actual chassis 31. Versus the M1 Pro, you can see the thermal signature is slightly different. So we have more heat concentrated about the middle. This is a little bit hotter by about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. And then you can see both of the exhaust vents here are exhausting quite a lot of heat. Now guys, bear in mind, these two heat signatures here are going to be more accentuated because I have the hinge of the MacBook pushed all the way back so that you can actually see it. If I was using this normally, the heat would be able to get out a little bit easier instead of some of it getting washed up onto the screen. And moving back to the M1 Pro, we can see the heat here about the same as the previous generation, maybe 1 or 2 degrees warmer. So taking a look at the final scores, we have 7,772 for the multi-core score on Cinebench on the previous gen versus 9,572 on the M1 Pro 14-inch. Now, you may have been able to hear the fan noise during the thermal testing. That was all coming from the previous gen MacBook. The fan was barely spinning on this machine and it was barely audible over the ambient audio levels in this room. So massive pro of upgrading to the 14-inch MacBook if you're not a fan, get it, of loud fan noise. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, we might be able to see a big difference here because this can be a very RAM intensive application. Obviously, you've only got 8 gigabytes of unified memory versus 16 gigabytes on the new 14-inch. So I've got a number of 24 megapixel raw photos here. So if we now open up the created cat, which is recording this video, by the way, she's the camera lady. If we now flick through all of the images, I'm not seeing any issues there at all. Very, very, very smooth, which is to be expected on Apple Silicon. We haven't really had any kind of bottlenecks or issues with Lightroom. Okay, now I've done some editing to these photos and we're going to export them and we're going to see if there is a difference. So you guys can see straight away the M1 Pro is pulling ahead. We're almost over halfway. Now we are halfway. So again, guys, I think this is mainly going to be because of the RAM. As you can see, the M1 Pro is just about to finish. So that's a difference of 10 seconds between the two, which isn't a huge amount, but you can imagine if you have several hundred, possibly even bigger than 24 megapixel photos, so 50 or 60 or up, it's gonna start to have an effect. Moving on to some 3D testing. As you can see here, we have a Blender test file up and running. Plays back really, really well on the M1 Pro. You can see it is struggling a bit on the previous gen Mac, but only just. You can see it's only dipping about 2 or 3 frames below this. So if we now come up and we render this particular scene, let's render 30 frames. We're gonna click that and we're gonna click the start button. And guys, while this is rendering, let's go into the activity monitor and we'll check out how the CPU, how the RAM, and also the GPU is performing under this load. All right, so as you guys can see, it has been 4.5 minutes and we have a clear MacBook in the lead. That is the 14-inch M1 Pro. We are already on frame 25 versus just frame 11 on the previous gen Mac. Now I have the GPU pressure chart and also the CPU history chart and the activity monitor up now if you want to have a look at how these two are performing. Typically though, we are seeing both the GPUs maxed out, so all 8 cores and all 14 cores. Not using a lot of the CPU, which is to be expected. This is Blender. And if we come in here to the memory charts and we have a look at the memory pressure, you can see the memory on the 8 gigabytes of unified RAM M1 MacBook Pro base model, not doing too well, almost completely maxed out, using 4 gigabytes of swap as well for a total of about 13 gigabytes in total for Blender, as you can see there. You can see we've also reached frame 30 on the 14-inch MacBook. I'll let it keep running just so we can have a look at the RAM. So memory pressure, nowhere near as bad as the base model. We're using 13 out of the 16 physical gigabytes of memory, 0 swap memory usage as well. And you can see there we're using a total of about 13 gigabytes, which is actually the exact same as the previous gen Mac, except this is relying a lot more on the slower swap memory. Now that the 30 frames have been rendered, you can see there was a clear winner. That was the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook with a time of 5 minutes and 23 seconds versus the previous generation M1 MacBook Pro at 12 minutes and 20 seconds. So that's a massive difference of over 50%. Now moving on to editing, and guys, I'm not gonna go too much into depth on this section. I'm gonna have separate videos on multiple editing topics. So I just wanna keep this one relatively simple. And we're just gonna stick to Resolve, which is one of the most popular platforms for editing on a Mac and is the most highly requested one from my subscribers. Now, before you ask, we are on Resolve 17.4, so it's the latest version with a lot of massive updates for Apple Silicon. As you can see here, we have 7 minutes of Sony A7S Mark III footage. I'll put the bitrate and the codec and everything up on the screen now so you can see it for yourself. We are playing this timeline back in 4K, as you guys can see there. So let's see if we can come over here and play this back smoothly. Okay, so as we can see, pretty easy there. I have added some LUTs and some minor color correction to this timeline. And if we now come to scrubbing, you can see we're getting a couple of dropped frames on the previous gen MacBook, but on the new 14-inch MacBook, the scrubbing is a lot better. A couple of dropped frames here and there, but I would say it's easily a lot better and a very, very big difference from the previous gen MacBook. Now moving on to the next test, which is stabilizing this 2-minute clip at the start. Now this footage is of course compressed. It's a very, very difficult codec to work with and edit with. So we're going to come over here to stabilization and we're going to hit the stabilize button. We're also going to start that timer. It's just the default stabilize settings. And as you guys can see, the 14-inch MacBook is by far in the lead. We're already at 15% versus 6% over here. So we'll let this run its course and I'll get back to you in a second. Okay, so we are just about to finish on the 14-inch. So let's lap that. So that's 1 minute and 1 second. And you can see we are not even halfway done on this previous generation MacBook. And a couple of minutes later, we're just about to finish on the M1 MacBook Pro. So stop that. And that has a final time of 2 minutes and 35 seconds versus 1 minute and 34 seconds for the 14-inch. So moving on to a render test. As you can see here, I'm rendering in QuickTime H.265 at 4K. And I'm going to add this to the render queue and we're going to render. And we're gonna see which one performs better. Now that the render has finished, now again, this was about 6 minutes of 4K footage. The 14 took 1 minute and 48 seconds, whereas the previous gen Mac took 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Now, even for the base model MacBook Pro, that's an extremely impressive performance, especially on this new version of Resolve. But as you guys will be able to see in those additional videos I'll be making on editing, when you start getting up in timeline resolution and the complexity of your timeline, this will really start to pull away. Now, moving on to some gaming, as you guys can see here, I've just spent the last 45 minutes doing some GFX bench benchmarks. As we can see from the Aztec Ruins, 2020 M1 MacBook Pro got 3,550.4 frames, or 55 FPS, versus 5,786 frames, or 89 FPS on the new 14-inch M1 Pro. Now, moving on to Tomb Raider, which is going to provide us with a little bit more of a real-world result. While this benchmark is running, I mean, you can see straight away the M1 Pro is pulling away. We're hitting about 30 to 35 FPS, whereas just about 18 to 20 FPS on the previous gen MacBook. And obviously the biggest difference in gaming is going to be the ProMotion display. It's very, very nice to use. Okay, so the gaming benchmark has just completed. As you can see here, we got an average of 20 FPS on the base model MacBook with a GPU min of 11 and a max of 38, so really not that great. And then on the 14-inch MacBook, we got an average FPS of 43, which is twice as good. And we have a min GPU of 32 and a max FPS of 77. At the end of the day though, Macs really aren't that great for gaming, as you can see here. Moving on to the battery, it's been several hours since I started filming this video. I've put both of these machines through the exact same tests, and they were also at 100% battery when we commenced. Now, as we can see here, the battery life is actually a little bit different between the two. So on the 14-inch MacBook, we have 41% remaining, and then on the older generation, we have 51%. So that is a difference of about 10% between the two in favor of the previous gen M1 MacBook. Now, the reason for this, I think, is that obviously you have so many extra cores in this particular machine. The GPU is just gonna suck a lot more of the power compared to this particular Mac. If it's just normal day-to-day usage, I think you'll find, as you guys have seen here, in my opinion, from my testing now, I think you'll get a little bit less battery life on the 14, but everything's gonna be a lot faster. So in the end, you're still probably gonna be coming out ahead with this machine, regardless of the exact battery percentages you see here. Now let's talk about pricing and my final thoughts and recommendations between these two devices. So starting with price, as you guys can see, there is a significant price difference. So $12.99 for the base model, 2020 M1 MacBook, and then $19.99, this is in US dollars by the way, for the new M1 Pro 14-inch base model. Now the main differences between the two, at least in my opinion, are the GPU cores. So you're gonna be getting those up to 32 cores extra if you get the upgrades, but at the absolute minimum, it's gonna be an extra 6 GPU cores. You're also obviously getting 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is gonna be really, really beneficial for certain applications as you've seen here, like video editing, Blender. The other thing that I'll also go into in other videos in more depth is you do get these specific video encoders, specifically for ProRes as well. So if your editing is very dependent on ProRes codecs and also Final Cut, you're gonna benefit a lot from that. One thing to mention though about the 14-inch model Mac in terms of pricing is the RAM and also the SSD. Now, in terms of RAM, you can see here for an extra $400, you can get 32 gigabytes of unified memory. I actually don't recommend a lot of people get 32 gigabytes. I think it's a little bit overkill unless you know for sure you're going to benefit from that extra 16 gigabytes. For example, if you're gonna be running VMs like Parallels and you're gonna be doing a lot of intensive stuff inside that VM, of course, get 32 gigabytes. If you're gonna be doing a lot of Blender rendering or also Adobe After Effects, you might be able to pick up the 32 gigs and it's gonna be cost effective. For everyone else though, I think you'll be totally fine with 16. Now I can't say the same about the storage. For an extra $200, you're going to double your storage. And as you guys saw from the SSD test earlier on in this video, you're getting a super, super fast internal SSD on the 14-inch Mac. Anyway guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video and I made the purchase decision a little bit easier for you if you're in the market for a new one. Let me know if there's any comments or questions or things you want me to see down below. Again, I've only had these devices for less than a day, but apart from that, I'll catch you guys in the next one.